The 60th book that I completed in 2024 is Comments on the Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. This is a tough read. It is thin. It looks like you would fly through it, and technically you could in a couple of hours, but it would take an awfully intelligent reader to be able to just read this straight through and not study what Debord is saying. I thought that it would be a critique of his original 1967 book. This was written in the 1980s while Ronald Reagan was president. Instead, it's more of a continuation. It's almost like a sequel to the first book. And I can't claim to pick up on everything that Debord is trying to say, but I do understand that he's a postmodern, and we still have the spectacle as the center of this book. And the spectacle, of course, is this idea that images have overcome reality. And by this time, in 1967, it was one thing, but by this time, we've got an actor in the White House. And so that further proves, I think, or further develops Debord's idea. Now, he's not alive anymore, but now we've had a president that was on a TV show that had no political experience whatsoever prior to being president. I mean, Reagan was at least governor of California before he became president of the United States, and he ran for president before he was successful in 1980. He ran for president in 1976 as well. So there was some qualification for Ronald Reagan to be president, but Debord would argue that there's no qualification for him and that there's no qualification for Trump either. And probably he would argue that there's no qualification for anybody to be president or hold any other office in a democratic state, because he would argue that the democratic state has given way to spectacle, and therefore the democratic state is just an illusion, as most things are in society. So we still didn't have social media at this time, but Debord's book is prescient. I mean, you can take what he writes and you can easily apply it to anything that we consider spectacle today. Television commercials, even war, he calls a spectacle. He thinks that most wars are fought to uphold commodification, to uphold the economies, the capitalistic economies of the Western world. And so even though some would argue that the West is successful, Debord would say, sure, they're successful in terms of capitalism, but does that bring happiness to most people? And of course, in the United States, we have this widening gap since 1972, I think, this widening gap between the rich and the middle class and the poor. And it just keeps getting wider and wider and wider, and nobody seems to want to do anything about it. Debord would blame that on the spectacle. There are things that are happening over here so that you don't notice the things that are happening over here. And power, which he defines as politicians and especially media, are controlling us to accept the spectacle as truth, when really the spectacle is just averting our eyes from what is actually true. This is a really good book. It's really dense. I think The Society of the Spectacle, written in 1967, is the better of the two. This is a collection of 33 aphorisms, whereas The Society of the Spectacle was a collection of over 200, and yet they're about the same length. That makes this book a little bit harder to understand and a little bit harder to read.